So thanks to everyone for coming. I'm not taking a really big topic, the future of identity management. I'll have the opportunity to, and this is my passion. This is an area, and former colleague of mine, Dan Bloom's out here, and Dan and I were doing projects in identity and access management 35, 40 years ago, and we'll see, maybe 35. There's a basis to kind of take a look at the past and take a look at where we are today and take a look at where technology is going in the future. And I've been doing this a long time. I helped run a company called Burton Group over 12 years or so through the sale to Gartner, which is now GTP, and was co-president of that for a year or so before doing other things, and 3 years ago starting my own research company called TechVision Research. And in fact, a little later this year in November, for those of you who remember Catalyst, we're going to do a conference that will actually have a lot of the folks that we had on stage at Catalyst over the years. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've written probably just from an identity and access management perspective over the last couple of years. I've written 8 to 10, 30, 50-page research reports on pretty much every element that's kind of associated with this. So I'll try to run through it at a high level. From a TechVision perspective, and I leverage a lot from our analyst team, from a TechVision perspective, you see IAM on the top. One of the things that we do is we look to connect these dots. And that's one of the things I'll talk about today. Identity and access management is never in a vacuum. And in fact, when we start to think about a lot of what we're now calling digital enterprise, but the digital transformation programs, these programs rely on the identity and the security infrastructure. So we spend a lot of time on that. From a research company perspective, everybody on our team has consulting and research experience. And I think in terms of developing the research, that experiential knowledge is great, but doing the consulting, having the vendor briefings and doing the analysis and having kind of a starter kit really helps as well. So enough about that. The session itself, I always like to start with just desired takeaways. So in a perfect world, what would I like to see you get out of this session? And it's obviously in a limited period of time, there's only so far we're going to go, but at least get an outside perspective on this desired future state. Obviously, every organization is going to internalize that. You're going to take these data points, you're going to take some of these models and thinking and apply it to your organization. We'll take a look at our approach, and there's lots of approaches out there to a reference architecture and applying that to IAM, hopefully help in investment priorities, strategies, investments, and so forth. And I'll repeat this several times during the session, and Wade will touch on some of these topics from a Radiant Logic perspective after I'm off. But this movement towards a flexible, open, dynamic IAM model, a lot of the things we're going to talk about, it's going to be absolutely critical to have that in the forefront and to be thinking about, how do we ensure that our future state is not locking us into a corner. Take the big picture view of identity and access management with a capital I. Make sure we're thinking about the extended range of objects that we have, and I'll have a few examples of that, and specific advice for executing this future state. So the big picture, and as a research firm, we've actually done a lot of work, and a lady on our team, Karen Hobart, and I are actually reframing a reference architecture around what we're no longer calling digital transformation, we're calling the digital enterprise. And it's not like you've transformed and you're there. The digital enterprise is the way we're doing business. It's the way we will continue to do business. The transformation needs to continue to be there. We need to iterate. It's a lot of the things we talk about in DevOps and so forth. We need to continue to adapt. So I'll talk about that. And then people like lists. So I'll have a top 10 list of the areas of focus. And then one overarching area that isn't on the list, but it's really important, that'll give you a flavor for. And we'll look at a couple of key areas, talk through, and just very quickly give you a sense for what we look at in developing a reference architecture, an action plan, and then I'll turn it over to Wade to figure out what's really happening, what they're implementing, user case studies, and so forth. So the big picture, and this is the way a lot of organizations think about, look at digital transformation. It's extending our footprint. It's customers, partners, employees. It's evolving to new ecosystems. We're starting to engage new types of processes. Robotics, process automation, all these kinds of things are starting to automate. We're starting to extend our connections and our reach with people, with data, with processes, and with things. And those are all objects, those are all things, objects and attributes that can be stored within the identity system if we architect it correctly. So this next slide I actually tried out about 3 weeks ago with the customer advisory board for a big vendor that had a bunch of CISOs, and we applied it in the security area. And there was a lot of agreement with this, but I'd love input on any of this. We have, and the reason I'm walking through this is, as I said at the beginning, identity is not going to be in a vacuum. Identity is going to be driven by a lot of these changes we have as we move to the digital enterprise and as organizations begin to change. So we have our kind of classic IT organization, centralized, controlling. We're moving more and more to this business aligned model. Agile, flexible, meeting business goals. We've had, from a governance perspective, a very fragmented, distributed, I can move this. Very fragmented, distributed type of model. We're moving to, and it's funny because at one level, we're moving a lot of things out to the edge, right? And it's more distributed processing and all those kinds of things. But from a governance perspective, given the issues that are involved, we're trying to bring that in. We're trying to get the dashboards and the visibility and control what's happening in these disparate environments. So that's moving to the central oversight, pervasive, coordinated. In the old IT environment, it was command and control. We're now looking at technology to facilitate the change, not to drive it, but to facilitate the change. Utilization, accessibility as we move to the cloud and so forth. In terms of, we've had these silos of technology, information, data, tied into big applications and so forth. Now we're looking at, these pieces that can be basically assembled and collected and leverage. So the focus is on this seamless integration. From an implementation perspective, the monoliths, the old types of applications, not that they're going away, but we're seeing a trend to the more responsive cloud-based with the focus functionally on the speed to value. How do we quickly instantiate these things and bring them out to the market? So digital transformation, or the digital enterprise, I should have rewritten this, requires identity and security transformation. At a high level, we're talking about leveraging and expanding these sets of relationships, but you can't do it. And in fact, there is no digital transformation or digital enterprise effort that's going to work without the right underpinnings from an identity and a security perspective. So again, and I'll stay big picture before I go into some of the specifics, and then Wade will get a lot more specific. But there are all of these trends that are occurring, and I'll talk about 1 through 4, and then talk about how some of these technologies are influencing it. So, and we've all talked about this. DevOps and microservices and getting these smaller pieces and moving faster and integrating the operational parts into our day-to-day development world. Privacy and data protection, of course, GDPR and CCPA and so forth, are in the forefront. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of other regulatory controls, and we're starting to see more and more of that. Enterprise security, and here's the tricky part, but identity can help here too. Enterprise security it's more proactive. The threats are militarized and much stronger, but on the other hand, there's extreme pushback in terms of the usability. So we have to figure out how to manage that. Disruption, innovation, change is a new normal. So we have this theme of smaller things, faster to market. So now, from the identity and access management perspective, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. And then we have technologies that can actually help support that and help manage it on one hand, but on the other hand can create new problems and new issues and new challenges. So, the movement to cloud, and I'll talk about that. Everyone talks about that. But that is pretty important in this model. Distributed ledger, blockchain technology. So the ability to set up trusted relationships on a peer-to-peer basis. The move to mobile. Big data, which of course then impacts the privacy. We collect all this data. AI and machine learning and a lot of these kinds of things, well, that can actually be interesting in terms of addressing number 3 in trying to figure out, well, how do we have an environment that is both proactive as well as user-friendly? Well, at a high level, and that leverages the cloud and big data as well. At one level, we better understand normal, and then we dig deeper for anomalous types of activities. I know I'm probably going too long, so I'll keep rolling along. So this was all a build-up. So we have this massive amount of change that's occurring, and that absolutely impacts how we look at identity and access management. So we have all of this change occurring, but now we want to figure out as architects, as enterprise business people, we want to figure out what investments do we make and how do we architect our IAM infrastructure in a way that supports the future state that we want to see. So the first one is a big one, probably a pretty obvious one. Everyone talks about it. We're moving to the cloud. I'd argue for most large enterprises, it's still going to be another decade before you're fully there. So we're going to have a lot of these hybrid environments that we're going to need to deal with. Highly scalable identity services. So a lot of those trends we talk about, IoT devices and so forth, moving from the enterprise to the consumer, that's going to drive just tremendous scale. The user experience I touched on, decentralized IDM, decentralized identity management. And I'll have a slide on that, and I'll talk about it a little bit. There's probably been 10 sessions here that have looked at various flavors of decentralized identity. But I do believe, not necessarily in the short term, but a little bit beyond that, that may be something enterprises want to begin to look at. We got to shore up security, and so support for multi-factor authentication, adaptive authentication, getting out of this password mess that many organizations are in today. The vendors are talking about that. That clearly is a trend and something we want to look at. Maybe have MFA be a bit more of a default, supported by some intelligence behind that, where you can figure out based on behavior and so forth, exactly when you want to pull the trigger on it. Diverse object types, I've talked about that. Customer-centric IAM and IDOT. I'll have a slide on that, but we're starting to get these categories of IAM services that are being introduced that have some specific functional requirements. In the long run, maybe they'll be merged together, but we're starting to see these separate categories now. Identity services is microservices. One of the things, we developed a DevOps reference architecture for a big government agency, and they, and as they're looking at microservices, a lot of times it's really easy not to look at the identity and the security components. Well, there's some challenges. We break the monolith into a million little pieces and then try to reassemble them. Major security challenges. So we should be doing the same thing and thinking about identity in the same way. Let's break up those little pieces. Let's have services that are available to secure those things that we're then assembling. Integrating privacy protecting identity and security services, leveraging analytics, machine learning, some of the things I was talking about a moment ago. And then the movement, I was at RSA several months ago, and I couldn't walk 2 feet without seeing zero trust something. And there's certainly a lot of hype around it, but a lot of the concepts I think are pretty valid. And we did a research report 6 months or so ago on it. But it was a specific area, zero trust networking. How do you get down to the network level and shore up all of that? And we have a networking expert who was on the calls, and he was new to the company, so I got on him to just kind of introduce the company to some of these vendors like Palo Alto Networks, a lot of the folks that kind of put a lot into ZTN. And I said at the beginning, I'm not really going to say anything because I don't really dig into the networking stuff. But then the whole conversation was about identity. And if you look at zero trust and how it's evolving, you have to understand the resources you have. You have to be able to categorize them. You have to understand the attributes to be able to support this model. So we've had this evolution over the years, and that kind of ties into it. Everything 30 years ago, it was all employee-centric, and here's how we shore up our enterprise, and we identify our employees to partners, to customers, to things. And now increasingly, you look at the one on the top, the relationships. That's going to be a really big thing over the next several decades, I'm sure. Because we're assembling all this stuff, but the context, and you think of IoT or any of these things, it's my car, but I happen to own it now, but there's the manufacturer, then there's all these sub-assemblies, and there's usage patterns that maybe I want to let be known or not. There's all of this kind of complex sets of relationships. On the other side, we had the classic IDM, if you will, moving to the cloud, moving to identity as an API, which I'll touch on, and finally decentralized identity. So enterprise cloud-based IAM progression, this is just one example, but we recognize that you're not going to eat the full buffet in one setting. There's going to be progress that will be made. And a lot of times, we'll see our clients just be cloud aware first from the IAM perspective, be able to be able to integrate with and recognize objects that are being generated by your SaaS applications. Factor in cloud migration really in all categories, and in a lot of companies that have big Microsoft shops, step one is to begin to move from AD to Azure AD. In the longer term, more and more cloud enabling. But then as we extend, look at the GDPR and the CCPA, the federation, the architectures, the ways to get there. This is just a quick example because we're starting to see these categories emerge. So we have identity of things, and there's some unique capabilities. And we actually did a report just on this. It's not that there are vendors that are kind of IDOT vendors quite yet, but it is a very specific use case, and there are some very specific requirements as we try to figure out, how do we collect data from kind of heterogeneous environment where maybe some of the devices are really intelligent, some of them aren't. So we're starting to, there's consortiums that are starting to be built, and we're looking to kind of, at the manufacturer level, get some unique identifiers that we can play with. But there's certainly some unique challenges there. SIAM is a category, and in fact, a lot of the leading SIAM vendors have been purchased by bigger vendors. And we're seeing some new ones there. So I won't deep end on this, although I can at some point. But I do believe the decentralized identity, blockchain, self-sovereign, whatever tag you want to put on it, is something enterprises should be looking at. Doesn't mean we need to execute it right away. But if you think about it, there is such a challenge. And this is a challenge that has existed for decades. But as we engage more and more as consumers and even business partners across the internet, you may go to 200 places and you're renting an ID and you're sharing PII on all of these different sites. And so at a conceptual level, it's a matter of having some self-declarative capability of saying, here's my identity, and there has to be some way to bind that and prove that I'm really who I say I am. But once I have that and it's cryptographically secured, to be able to then use that data rather than every place you go saying, well, let me explain again who I am, and just fundamentally, and we're beginning to get some of the bigger vendors behind it. There's several startups, Evernym, ShowCard, Civic, Trusted Key. There's several smaller vendors, but IBM's involved, and Microsoft is really making some investments in that space. And if you think about it, having their ecosystem that then includes another type of object like this that can be managed within that might help move this forward. So it's just something to kind of pay attention to. So how do I architect a solution to fit within this model? And this was the kind of the 11th thing in my top 10 list that was, this is kind of an overarching area that as we move to the digital enterprise, in identity governance, but governance in particular, think about all these things we're trying to manage now. So the ability to get a handle on the governance, to get a handle on the things that we have out there, and to invoke the right actions at the right time is going to be absolutely critical. The scale thing I've talked about, the microservices, there's this identity of everything. So more and more, things to manage, and I do certainly recommend that you take the big I, as I said earlier. So this is pretty standard stuff in terms of developing a plan. Really, any consultancy will kind of walk through this. You take a look at your current state capabilities. The one thing that we'll do is we're trying to codify this a little bit more with the reference architecture. So we're taking a pretty simple kind of first pass, and then we'll dig down layer after layer. How do you interact? How do you access things in real time? How do you instantiate change? How do you manage this? How do you store it? And then the measurement, the feedback loop to hopefully self-correct over time. You can take it a step deeper, and you can look at, in the interfaces, there's both the real end user and there's the developer, and they have very different needs. Authenticate, authorize, federate, privileged. The federate and privileged are really kind of subsets of the earlier classes, but you can, but they have pretty special and specific needs. Lifecycle management, we can go a step deeper. And I think these either take pictures if I leave it up long enough, or hopefully these slides will be available. But I think this gives you a starting point. And the reason we like, and we'll use this a lot in our consulting and also in our research reports, the reason we like this is it helps make sure we're not forgetting things. And there are so many moving parts here. The ability to kind of take these and assemble them, and then we'll go, a layer or two deeper. But no matter what us or anyone else does, ultimately you have to internalize that. So we can take each of those categories and look to come up with certain technical positions. And if this and this, then we recommend you move in that direction. And generally, what we recommend is you do that before you're out to the vendors, before you're generating your RFPs and so forth, because then you have a good handle on exactly what you need. So don't forget to clean up your mess. This is, all of the stuff I just talked about is almost going to be irrelevant if you don't get your present environment cleaned up, organized, structured properly, you reduce your redundancies, you know where your data is. You can do that through standards, you can do that through some of the stuff Wade will talk about. There's lots of ways to get there, but having this mess that frankly a lot of organizations have, it's difficult to execute this digital enterprise strategy. It's difficult to leverage IAM for it. I'm not going to talk in detail about these, but identity orchestration, how that really all plays together, is really important, and that's a means of cleaning up the mess and doing some of these things in real time. From a development perspective, one of the things Andre said yesterday in his keynote is identity needs to be invisible, and this is one of the ways identity can be invisible. And it needs to work in concert. And this will play into several of the things Wade will talk about. Lastly, just to kind of summarize what I talked through, consider these future state directions. It doesn't mean it's right for you, but factor it into your plans. Invest in the consistent governance model. Understand it requires cleaning up the mess, so to speak. And it's necessary to do to leverage some of these emerging solutions and to have the flexibility. Talked about IoT several times and the identity of everything. And I'll close with the future state IAM model. And we have been saying this for years. It needs to be open, adaptive, flexible, scalable, include these new objects. The adaptive and flexible part, I've never had a client years later who said, I'm really glad I got locked into this corner, and I had this proprietary solution. So especially when you have the opportunity to do this planning, make sure you think about that up front. We are going to have a conference. You can contact me if you want further detail. We're going to have a lot of the old Burton Catalyst team that will be there. It's in November. In beautiful San Diego. So with that,
all right,
hand over the token.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to take a step forward here and build on what Gary's talked about and take the strategic model and talk a little more tactically about what can you do actually in moving bits around and in working in your environment to achieve a lot of the goals that Gary laid out. I can't give you a 20-year roadmap, that we don't have that much time, but I can give you some things to take on immediately. If you went to any of my earlier presentations, this is the one slide I'm reusing. I am stealing from myself, but I think it makes a good point. These are two very large skyscrapers now in downtown San Francisco. You may recognize the white one. That's the Salesforce Tower. It's now the tallest building in San Francisco. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, was quoted as saying, I can go anywhere in San Francisco now and see my building. And that's true, he can. And you would assume it was like the Empire State Building. It's the building everybody goes to see in San Francisco now. It's not actually. It's the one next to it that is actually getting more tourist attraction and more people coming to see. That's the Millennium Tower. And the reason people are coming to see that apartment building is it is leaning 14 inches to the west and sinking 12 inches into the ground. And the reason it's doing that is that the Salesforce Tower was built on bedrock. They drilled down to a foundation of rock. The Millennium Tower thought if they just put down enough good pilings into sand, it wouldn't be a problem. They'd deal with it later if it was. Their building's falling over. They got major issues. Foundations are critical. You've got to lay your foundation first. And this is exactly where Radiant Logic sits in the equation. We sit between all the sources of identity you have, whether they're on-premise, in the cloud, databases, directories, regardless of where that information is. And I'll expand the conversation because, as Gary mentioned, with IoT and a number of other areas and customer-based information, it's not just corporate employees we're talking about anymore. It's any object out there that has attributes about it that you can relate to other objects that you can use to make systems work better, identify, authenticate, authorize, and build a world in which your customers have a stronger, more positive experience, your machines know how to talk to each other. Whatever that model is, being able to build a foundation that allows that flow of information from your sources of information, your sources of identity, to all the consumers of identity information. Those columns on the top there are the sort of recognized monoliths within the identity space that have been aggregated by a lot of vendors, but you've got provisioning and password and access control. You've got access management in the middle there, single sign-on, much more of that going to the cloud now with SAML-based and OAuth access to SaaS applications. And on the right-hand side now, the one that's been driving us for years now is governance, the ability to see my whole environment and understand, do people have the access they're supposed to have? Can I review that access? Can I make sure that it's right? All those pillars on the top there depend on quality data that's been normalized, that's been aggregated, that understands that John Smith and Jay Smith and J2158 are the same person, and I can unify them, and that J Smith 9 is not the same person, I don't want to add him in. So there's a lot to do here in terms of how to build that foundation. So we'll talk tactically about how you go ahead and take a look at doing that. As Gary mentioned, digital transformation requires an expanded view of identity and security. It's not just the old username and password before, it's relationships, especially if you're doing digital transformation around the customer side. It's not just can you authenticate me to your website, but they want the Amazon experience. They want to know that you know a lot about them. You can push that information back to them. You can use your internal systems to analyze the data you have about your customers and then adapt their experience to exactly what information they need to see, what's going to motivate them to fill in the gaps in your product line. They may own 2 of your 3 major products. Why not the third? Let's put the third one in front of them. How do I know that? Because I see enough about my customer to make those decisions. But now if you talk about zero trust and adaptive authentication, you're trying to make sure someone has the right access to the right resources. You need a rich set of attributes. You need real-time information. You need to aggregate data from multiple places to minimize that risk vector and that surface that can be attacked and make sure that people are who they say they are and their authorization is correct in the context they're in. The CFO should be able to see payroll information sitting in his office, but if he's sitting at a Starbucks on a jailbroken iPad from his son trying to do it over a hijacked Wi-Fi signal, probably not a good time for him to be looking at salary information. So there's areas where you need to be able to understand the broader sense of identity beyond just the user itself. And then creating relationships between objects. Context is a model that Radiant Logic has been talking about for a long time. It's the ability to relate and join information together. So I get data from multiple sources and I aggregate that together and build a relationship of, say, a salesman to the people that he sells to the products that they buy, to the orders that they place, to the deliveries that were done. That chain of information, that supply chain now can be incorporated into business decisions. And if you start looking at AI engines, you start looking at analyzing patterns, you start looking at the way information is consumed, you start to see now the requirement, the necessity for that contextual relationship model. But you have to have a foundational layer that can understand how to join that information together, how to build and maintain that context. A flat list of users is not contextual. It doesn't get you anywhere until you've enriched that with a lot of information, but then key field ties to relationships that let you flip that view around, so I can look from salesperson to vendor to product, or I can look from product to vendor to salesperson from the same data set by moving that information around. And this is really, again, where Radiant Logic comes into play. If you look at the web of information and relationships in the center of this particular graphic, that's the way the world works. You can think of it, here at Identiverse, you probably know somebody that knows somebody in the room that's sitting within 5 or 6 people of you. if you made that connection, if you talked to people. When you were at an event last night, you talked to somebody and said, oh, I know so-and-so, so do I, we used to work together. There's all these webs of relationship, but they're not visible unless you start peeling into them one at a time. But if you can take those relationships and reconstruct them in different directed graphs, those outlying models 1, 2, and 3 on the side, you can build relationships within that set of data that you can actually consume as a directory infrastructure, as something that machines understand, something that can be computed and used. But it's not one structure, it's multiple structures pulled from that same set of relationships. And that's the key. The traditional model used to be one directory, one structure, one schema, one format. That's what you had to live with. With Radiant, you get the ability to build multiple schemas, multiple structures, multiple sets of relationships from the same data set within the same solution. So now you're serving multiple masters and multiple purposes from a single set of aggregation. You want to do the heavy lifting once and then be able to reuse that over and over again. So as you build this relationship between attributes and values, you can start to key that into the way relationships work within your organization and start to make that information much more available. And in the case of just simple prescriptions, you can start to look from an insurance company standpoint across all the prescriptions your patient gets across all the doctors that he gets from all the pharmacies, and quickly be able to figure out that 2 doctors don't know they're prescribing across each other, and now I've got a drug interaction issue that I need to deal with, only because I can look at this information from a relational database or relational model and be able to consume that. So how do you start? Can I jump to the fun stuff first? Can I just go to single sign-on? How about if I just go to the cloud and start using SaaS applications? No, please. Don't go to the frosting first. Have your vegetables. I know nobody likes vegetables, but you need to eat them. They build a strong body. You need to be able to make this something that you can live with and design on top of. So you need to do some discovery and some analysis, some design, plan, and then implement. It's the old project management model that everybody likes to hop to the end on. But the key here is discovery, analysis, and then lay out a comprehensive and flexible foundation, because as Gary mentioned, change is the new paradigm. We're going to have something new coming down the road. 5, 7 years ago, if you told me about the cloud, I would think in the IT context you're talking about the weather. Now I clearly know that you're referencing hosted information someplace else. I don't know what's coming in 5 years, but it's going to be disruptive. It may be sovereign identity, and how is that going to flip the table on what we do if all of a sudden I don't own identity anymore, my end user does, and I've got to cater to his particular requirements. But you need a foundation that's built on the idea of being flexible and standards-based and agnostic, so you can incorporate all those new pieces into the play. So how do you discover what you have? You can't see it easily, and as Gary mentioned in the slide, you need to clean up your existing mess, but the traditional challenge has been, well, in my AD environment, I've got as many groups as I have users. I'm a company of 10,000, I've got 10,000 groups. I'm a company of 100,000. I got 120,000 groups. I'm winning, yay. No, you're not winning, but you're still ahead. The challenge is you can't easily go in and see this stuff normally in any one place. And if you dump it out into spreadsheets, that just gets ridiculous. There's no table big enough to spread that information out. So you need a tool that can let you bring all this information together, do data analysis on it very quickly, and then be able to build a unified single pane of glass, a single view of that data, so you can look through your environment and understand the relationships between different systems, who that John Smith is in every different platform, and see the attributes, the groups, the information, the relationship, and the context that person has. And as you start doing that, you start to find anomalies very quickly. You start to find gaps in your data. You start to find simple things like half my data systems spelled out California, half of them abbreviated it, half of them abbreviated it with a capital A and a little a, and I can't search on California with one filter and get back more than 20% of my data. How do I rationalize this? This is again where that flexible layer sitting in between there gives you an ability to massage that data, clean it up, normalize it without going to the back-end systems and changing things. Because if you've ever gone back to a domain admin and said, hey, I need you to go in and reformat all your states to 2 capital letters, they'll say, sure, I'll get right on it. First of all, they don't have time. Secondly, it's likely going to break something. They've got a dependency on spelling out California for some reason. So you need to be able to do this in a non-disruptive way. And then you need to be able to pull those disparate sources together. Databases and directories and web services and APIs coming from Workday, those don't sit in the same model. They don't fit together well. It's not like Lego where everything snaps from one end to the other. You've got to be able to transform and translate and understand protocol relationships. You need, again, that flexible middle layer, that foundation that understands how to do all that. Oh, wrong button. There you go. And as mentioned earlier in Gary's slide, that identity orchestration is the key. You need to be able to pull this information together. And my euphemism here basically is a symphony. If you think of a symphony makes beautiful music together, but if you take individual pieces, they are not like each other at all. An oboe and a cello are as far away from each other as you could imagine. You've got a guy back on a timpani and somebody else on a trumpet, but they're all working together. They're working together with different structures and schemas and protocols and formats, but you can unify them together to make a single song and all march in the same direction. So if you think of that model in terms of your identity infrastructure, you need to be able to bring them all into one room. You need to connect everything together. Then you need to aggregate them and join them. You need to group them together where it's logical. You need to put them in the right places, because if you actually look at the way the symphony sits, that has a lot to do with the way things sound, where everybody is in the room. And then you need to transform that into a unified, everyone singing from the same page model, and then perform that, deliver that. I mean, if you're doing it alone in a building and no one's seeing it, then it doesn't have a lot of value. You have to be able to deliver that information. The challenge with identity management is that every application wants to see the world differently. One likes jazz, one likes rock, somebody else likes opera. They all want that information a particular way that meets their needs, and not one system easily satisfies that. So you need a platform that can do all this work and then republish that information in all the different formats and structures and schemas and protocols, or all the different styles of music that each of those particular applications wants to hear. And when you can do that, again, you've done the heavy lifting once, but you're delivering this system in a single model that can be reused over and over again. And this is a direct pull from Gary's slide here. It's an excellent illustration of aggregation of identity information, building together a unified view of the user. Some unified views may not need all the data from all the places to serve a particular purpose. Others may need to correlate data for even outside the organization. I may need to pull data in from a partner network or a training system that certifies my people for certain access that I then grant them based on them completing training. And then on the top there, you can see the information delivered in a hierarchical model and a global regional model. I can filter that data, I can put structure into it, I can build relationship. Because at every layer here, I have the ability to manage this information down to the attribute level and combine and aggregate and join and build unions of that data. So it makes this information much more powerful, much more usable, and much more flexible. Because again, I don't know what's coming. So as something else comes down the road and needs something, we started building REST interfaces like 8 years ago when REST was just first coming out. We put Skim 2 into our platform the minute they released it. The ability to adapt to new protocols and new standards and new selections makes this data reusable over and over again. So it's not your grandma's LDAP directory anymore. It's a transformational data aggregation layer. And we've actually rebranded ourselves to Federated Identity Service because it is federating identity, bringing together disparate identity sources, just like you're federating access by bringing everything together for single sign-on. And this plays in multiple scenarios, not just authentication authorization in the traditional model, but as we go to the cloud, we are provisioning more and more identities out to third-party endpoints. We're being asked to pile information into a claim to just on time provision someone, or write to an API to create all my users in the cloud, or bring my partners into my Okta environment so they can access applications that I'm sharing. All this requires ideally a pristine, clean data image to be able to do that. You don't want to source garbage in, garbage out. You don't want to go from your old house to a brand new house and take all the mess in the garage and just move it into the new garage. This is an excellent opportunity to clean up, get that pristine image together that you want to be able to use, and then be able again to reuse that over and over again. This model is a little deceptive because it kind of looks like you're on premise at the bottom, you're in the cloud at the top, but The model I want to encourage people to look at is an ecosystem where you're actually looking at your environment as a global model in which you are looking at the whole world as a single interactive model. That the endpoint relationships that we have are just connecting to sources of identity. So if it's a source in the cloud and you're provisioning the cloud, you're moving to AWS, you've got information there. You still want to include that in your global profile. Whether the system sits in AWS or it sits on-premise or it sits in a hybrid model, you want to be able to look and understand that data on a global view. It's a full ecosystem as opposed to the us and them model. If you've got a cloud group and an internal legacy group, you really need to take a look structurally and merging that together. You need to be one unified identity group because there isn't an us and a them anymore. This is an identity, and if it's an object with attributes somewhere, you should know about it, you should be able to find it, you should be able to work with it. If you can remember CAMP on the top there, then you really understand how Radiant Logic works. This is basically our 3-day training course in 2 slides. First thing we're going to do is connect to the back-end system. So once we've connected to a back-end platform, which are all standards-based, API-driven on cloud applications, whatever you need to do to get that data, we're going to abstract the relationship. This is critical. You're not pulling out a flat list from a back-end. If the back-end has relationship already, don't throw that away. That's the best part, right? So you want to pull that information in, hold on to that relationship, bring that up into a working model, and then be able to correlate, aggregate, be able to integrate that information together, join data for common users across multiple systems, build a union of users across multiple platforms that are disparate. And we can do this across many different key field elements. We can do a lot of data mining and data cleanup. We can concatenate and generate key fields. We can do a lot of work here in the product to pull all this together. And everything I'm talking about today is mouse-driven. This is not a development infrastructure where you and 5 developers are going to sit in cubicles for 6 months and pop out at the end going, hey, it looks like the demo they did. No, this out of the box is something you do in days with a mouse. I don't write code, and I can put this whole platform together in a complex environment literally with the mouse itself. And once I've modeled all this information, once I've built these relationships, I can decide then, how do I want to expose this information to the outside world? How do I want to publish this data? I may have a vertical list of all my identities just basically in a common root because I want to be able to do some sort of simple single sign-on, or I want to do a search down that whole common root. I may build a new hierarchical model there, the second one over, where I build new sets of relationships. I may have one big flat list because my single sign-on just wants to do a quick lookup. Do you exist? Yes, great. Here's my credential. Go figure out where it belongs and map that credential check to the proper backend. Or I can build a whole new set of hierarchies on the other end. I can build that relationship between salespeople and products and customers and everything they need. And I can simultaneously make this information available over and over again to whatever application in whatever schema, structure, protocol, and format and subset of users that I want to expose, without having to stand up a new infrastructure. And that's really the key piece here, is this whole transformational model from intake to aggregation to manipulation to porting it out by different services and then feeding those needs of those particular applications exactly as they need them. And you'll notice it's not just an LDAP directory. We can represent this as a SQL table. We can respond back to an XML response on a web services SOAP call. We can give you a REST response in JSON to a REST query. So if you were writing mobile applications or you have any developers under 25 and they don't know how to spell LDAP, we can just give them REST off the same data set. You don't have to worry about what the back end looked like. It can be AD in a database, and you can query it on REST, and we can put the information all the way back to the back end if you need to. The key other piece that Gary touched on was scale. Scale is critical, right? You've got to be able to scale your system. So with Radiant Logic, it's not just that logic engine that we talked about in the blue bubble here, but we have that combined with our HDAP store. Our HDAP store is a LDAP v3 compliant directory store that we created to solve some of the major challenges with LDAP. It's based on big data technology, Hadoop, Lucene, and Zookeeper, to allow us to run in a RAID array style, highly available cluster, along with the ability to do block level replication between the servers, to overcome a lot of the challenges of scaling. Because you start talking about millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of objects, and you start talking about relationships and groups, and being able to go through that data quickly and be able to determine who's a member of what, and what attributes am I using to do dynamic grouping, you have to have performance built into the system. So not only is it a foundational layer, but it's not a master data management platform in the sense that I built this great data warehouse and every night after running 12 hours of report generation I can get answers out of it. This is an authentication authorization warehouse. You've got all the information here, but you can pull that data in real time, and real time at a massive scale, which is critical. And the ability to deploy that now across multiple data centers, on-premise, in the cloud, multi-nation. We've got customers all around the world. We have customers sitting with data centers in Germany and the US, and the German data centers don't let any German data leave German soil. But because I can proxy this information, because I can make a call from one system to the other and pull back a response, I can build a view in the US that looks like the German data is there. It's never on the ground, it's always pulled on the back end. But if I have an executive traveling internationally and he comes to the US, he's going to see his name on the list, he's going to be able to authenticate, he's going to have the access to the authorization information that he needs to do his particular job. So I can build this global view again, this ecosystem where I'm not necessarily just talking about one data center or another, but I'm talking about a unified, replicated, shared data system that spans multiple clouds, spans multiple nations, spans multiple purposes. And at each of these particular endpoints, I can decide what set of data I want to include there. What information is important? Leave the German information on German soil. In my Google Cloud, it's really all my DevOps people, everybody doing AI work, everybody running on the Google systems doing high-end computes. Over on Amazon, it's all my infrastructure people, all my Linux stuff is up there, all my apps are running up there. And over on Azure, I've got all my Office 365 and all my back-end information. Different sets of users, supersets, subsets. I can break that information down as I need to, and then replicate changes immediately across the infrastructure. So whenever I have something that has been changed, been provisioned, somebody comes on board, somebody leaves, I need to get them out of all my systems immediately. Real-time replication of the information across the system. It's not going to wait for an overnight batch fill up to let the guy have all night to go in and download your customer information. He's going to be off the system before he hits his car in the parking lot if your system is configured that way. So your foundation enables customer information management and digital transformation, as we mentioned. Context, which is critical, gives you a place to start from. It's a first step. Again, don't go to the dessert. Have your vegetables. You'll feel better. You'll eat less dessert. Visibility across your ecosystem is critical. You need to be able to see everything that's here. Everything works together much more easily. This makes other platforms more efficient, more easily implemented. If you're doing a governance solution, having this data clean and available and already correlated and ready to feed your governance solution saves months of work. Any other system you've got for single sign-on, we have people, for years now have been throwing out CA because it's terrible, it's hard to work with, it's difficult, the policies are a mess to manage. It's not CA's fault. You're asking CA to talk to 9 different disparate back-end systems with no correlation, with not any data integrity. It's going to struggle. If you give it one place to go to get all the information it needs in exactly the way that it needs to see it, it gets really simple and it runs really well. And that works for every other access management system out there. You've got to be able to scale. It's got to be flexible. And I'm at the top of the hour, or a little past. I appreciate everyone hanging in. We're available for questions if you have any, and great to have you here today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.